Bible is replete with individuals and peoples who have brought shame to their name. The stories of their downfall and tragic ending have been passed down throughout history. Such as Jezebel, Queen of Israel. She drove the nation into idolatry to the ear of God. Or Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, who would later go on to betray Jesus. Still another to earn themselves ill repute would be the Laodiceans. Who were these obscure peoples? We will visit this question on today's segment of Truth Unveiled. Many individuals and groups of people spoken of in the Bible have had negative connotations associated with their names. So much so that their names have crossed over into modern-day vernacular with a stigma attached to them. One such example of this would be that of the Laodiceans. Today, I'd like to consider who were the Laodiceans. When we look at it, we see that the Laodiceans were residents of the city of Laodicea. Laodicea was a province in the Roman Empire in the 1st century. Like many cities in the Roman Empire, Laodicea had its own distinct characteristics and attributes that defined who and what the city was. Likewise, we can look at cities of our own day and see how there are certain characteristics and details about that city that designate and define to any traveler's mind, anyone that would recollect or think about the city, that would detail what is that city, who is that city, what are the people about. Take, for example, New York City. When one thinks of New York City, what are some of the attributes that come to mind? For one, many would think of the enormous traffic, the enormous vehicular traffic, and many cars streaming throughout the city. Others may think of the yellow taxis that are very distinct in New York. Still, others may recollect the throngs of people moving about on the sidewalk, crossing the street, or perhaps the mass number of people taking New York City's subway system, getting from one place in the city to another. Still, when others think of New York City, they will think of the tall skyscrapers littered all about the city, with the Empire State Building being one of the most recognized buildings in New York. Others may think of the food, from the New York street hot dog vendor to the New York-style pizza sold in the pizzerias about the city. Still, others will think of the cultural institutions and museums that New York has to offer. Others may recollect the local sports teams, from the New York Yankees playing at Yankee Stadium to the New York Knicks playing out of Madison Square Garden, a marquee venue in the middle of the city. Even the New York City Police Department is renowned, featured in television shows and movies. When one thinks of a New Yorker, one may think of the moxie or the grit, perhaps the accents, and maybe a bit of ill temper. And so, likewise, when one thinks of Laodicea, or particularly individuals of that day in the 1st century, there were certain aspects about the city that would register with them. And when we look at Laodicea, we see that the city was immensely wealthy. The occupants and the people of the city were so wealthy that in AD 60, an earthquake struck the area, totally devastating and destroying the city, destroying much of the infrastructure there in Laodicea. The Roman Empire stepped in to provide assistance and relief aid. However, the Laodiceans turned it down. Instead, they opted to rebuild the city out of their own pockets, of their own means, of their own resources. They paid for it themselves. Doing so made the city famous, and they became famous for their ingenuity and for their self-sufficiency. No other city could perform and behave in that manner. There were other things about Laodicea that stood out. For one, Laodicea had a number of hot, cold, and lukewarm springs. Many throughout the empire would come because it was believed that the springs had minerals in the water that fostered healing properties. So a number of infirmed people would come to take advantage of those healing elements and to soak in those waters. Interestingly enough, if one were to drink the water from these springs, they would become nauseous to their stomach. Other details about Laodicea entailed it having medicinal properties and products that they produced and attractions there in the city. Laodicea was home to a temple that was dedicated to the Greek god of healing. At this temple was also a university. Here at the university, eye salve was produced and distributed throughout the empire. This eye salve was used to treat eye ailments and eye diseases. In addition, Laodicea was home to the production of black wool. Black wool was highly sought after in the Roman Empire by many Romans, and it was used to create apparel that was in high demand at the time. And so Laodicea, we see, had a very vibrant commercial aspect to it. It had a very strong banking system and a strong financial institution that was operating there. So much so that many Romans preferred to invest their money, to put their money in the Laodicean banks, as opposed to other areas of the empire. And so it's with this background, it's with this understanding that allows us to have a greater context, particularly when we move to look at those scriptures that speak to Laodicea. And we see such being done in Revelation chapter 3, and we break into a narrative where Christ has been distributing messages to 7 local congregations and 7 of the cities in Asia Minor there in the 1st century. And entailed in these messages are evaluations of the 1st century churches. What's also interesting about the message to Laodicea, the final message, the 7th of the messages, is that of all the other congregations spoken to, not one positive thing was said about Laodicea. Not one single positive thing was mentioned concerning the Laodicean church. And let's look into what Christ had to say in his evaluation. In Revelation chapter 3 and in verse 14, we have, "To the angel of the church in Laodicea write." And so what is going to commence is Christ's evaluation and recognition of the Laodicean church's behavior and performance. We see here mentioned that this is being addressed to the angel of the church in Laodicea. And the book of Revelation is a prophetic book. It's a book that entails much symbols, but it also can have degrees of literalness to it as well. So indeed, this passage is directed to Laodicea, but the mention of an angel here is serving more so as a proctor, where information, designated information and understanding will be made available at its assigned time. Moving on and continuing in verse 14, "These are the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the ruler of God's creation." And so we find Christ identifying himself and acknowledging who he is and his role in the church. And he's taken on the name of the Amen, the Amen, which is Greek for truth. And Christ has ascribed this name to himself, being truth, operating under truth. In verse 15, we continue, "I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other." And Christ admits to the Laodiceans that he's familiar with their deeds, with their works, with their behavior, with the way that they think, with their performance in taking these spiritual aspects of what God requires of us, and how that's entailed in the way that we think and the way that we behave. And we come to find that the Laodiceans were faulty in doing this, and they weren't very zealous. And Christ goes on to say that he recognizes that they are neither cold nor hot. And in doing so, he's also speaking the language that the Laodiceans would be familiar with. He's using terminology that is existent in their day-to-day lives, referencing those hot, cold, and lukewarm springs that we mentioned earlier. And so the Laodiceans, they're not very zealous for God's way of life, for putting it into practice and chasing the spiritual aspects of living God's way. They weren't allowing the Spirit of God to transform their minds in the way that they think, to alter their character. And so they weren't hot. They weren't zealous for God's way of life. But at the same time, they weren't cold either. They were adherent to some degree to God's requirements. They weren't allowing God's Spirit to transform their mind, but they were conforming to an outward sense of religion. And Christ expresses he wishes that he was able to work with someone that was truly obedient or just outright disobedient, as opposed to just in the middle, kind of ambivalent. They're there, but they're not really trying. Verse 16, so because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. Now Christ is giving fair warning that if they were to continue with this degree of ambivalence, with this attitude, with this way of approaching God, that there was going to be a degree of separation that they would experience. Christ is saying that he's going to spit them out of his mouth, vomit them out of his mouth. He's saying that he's become nauseous, and he's recognized that indeed, just like the cold and hot springs that were existent in Laodicea, that would make one nauseous, he too is experiencing a degree of disgust and discomfort by their behavior. And in so doing, they were going to experience a separation from the body, from Christ. Verse 17, you say, I am rich, I have acquired wealth, and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Christ then moves on to discuss their state of mind. And their attitude was, I'm good. I have a great relationship with God. I am righteous myself. And it's all the other individuals that are at fault, that are coming up short. But they didn't see themselves as the way God saw them. And so Christ says that the Laodiceans viewed themselves as being rich, and indeed they were. However, Christ is referring to being rich spiritually. The Laodiceans thought that the attributes of spiritual growth was highly developed in them, and in actuality, it wasn't. Verse 18, Christ continues, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, so you can become rich. And here again, Christ is speaking of being rich spiritually, being rich and wealthy spiritually. And he's advising the Laodiceans to engage in a remedial course of developing God's characteristics, because they weren't doing so prior, and now they're going to have more of an expedited, accelerated course and focus on their relationship with God. And in so doing, they may very well be exposed to trials and tribulations and problems and difficulties in order to be placed in a proper environment where that kind of development can ensue, spiritual development. And so here we have a group of people living in an opulent city with great wealth being told to now pursue the very riches they thought they had. Continuing on, Christ urges them to buy white clothes to wear so they could cover their shameful nakedness, and salve to put on their eyes so they can see. And the irony of this, that those that were very profitable manufacturers of apparel are being told to buy clothes. Those that were the manufacturers of eye salve were told to buy it themselves. Those that had immense wealth and had plenty gold were being told to now seek out spiritual gold themselves, because these were the things that they were lacking, despite how comfortable and secure they thought they were because of their physical conditions. And so when we look at these admonitions, we may consider, well, what does that have to do with us? How does this apply to us? This was for a group of people that existed 2,000 years ago, long gone. And indeed, at the beginning of Christ's message to the Laodicean congregation, he did recognize that it was to the Laodiceans, but was it solely meant for them? At the end of Christ's admonitions in verse 22 of Revelation chapter 3, we see Christ be even more specific about who this message is directed to. Revelation 3, verse 22, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. This is addressed to whoever has ears, whoever is capable of hearing, whoever is able to understand. And we see that this now opens it up to everyone. Everyone capable of processing what Christ has shared should take this to heed. And so this would apply to us today as well. Have we become complacent? Complacent in our relationship with God? Complacent in our own righteousness? Do we examine if we are truly allowing God's Spirit to transform our minds into the way that He thinks, into the way that He reasons, so that our character would become more and more like His? Or are we simply conforming to degrees of religiosity? We need, like the Laodiceans, to address ourselves, address our inner development, to make sure that we indeed are open to God's correction and direction. And these were the very same things that the Laodiceans failed to do. But we need to look at ourselves to make sure that we do not follow in their footsteps and make the same mistakes.
Hi, we would like to offer some free online sermons that will help you examine today's topic. We would like you to listen to the sermon, Exploring the Laodiceans, by George Roper. Also the sermon, Are You a Philadelphian or Laodicean? By Ed Shalankiewicz. You can find these sermons by visiting cgi.org and visiting the sermon section of the website and searching for the title of the message. If you live in New York City, New York, and would like to attend church with today's presenter, George Roper, visit cginewyork.org for more information. Thanks again for watching Truth Unveiled.